Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're literally putting on our investigative hats to dig into the early chapters of Genesis, specifically chapters 6 through 11. I mean, these pages pack in some of the absolute most debated, perplexing, and honestly fascinating mysteries in all of ancient literature. We're going to look closely at what the text actually says, how scholars interpret it, and what it reveals about the ancient Near Eastern world. So if you've ever wondered about the giants, the wildly massive lifespans, or the real actual scale of the Great Flood, well, you are exactly in the right place.
All right, here is our roadmap. We're walking chronologically through 5 main areas today: the mysteries of early Earth, the identity of the Nephilim, the Great Flood, Noah's downfall, and finally, the Tower of Babel. Let's get to it.
Section 1. Mysteries of Early Earth, the Pre-Flood World. So we kick things off in an era detailed through a whole bunch of extensive genealogies. Now I know reading lists of names might seem kind of tedious at first glance, but these records actually serve as this powerful foreshadowing of God's people being written into the book of life. It's showing us that ancient people weren't just some nameless mass. Individual lives really mattered. But as you're reading these genealogies, there's one detail that just completely jumps off the page and practically demands an explanation: incredibly, strangely long human lifespans. Seriously, in Genesis chapter 5, figures are typically living into their 900s. I mean, just imagine the number of candles on those birthday cakes, right? There is a really fascinating exception with Enoch, though. He lived a highly symbolic 365 years before God just took him. But for everyone else, life was incredibly long. However, if you track the text, you'll see these massive lifespans drastically drop off after the flood by the time we hit chapter 11. Why the sudden plunge? Well, scholars suggest this decrease was possibly due to the cumulative physical effects of sin, mutations, and just general disease taking a heavy toll on the human body over millennia. It's like a battery slowly losing its charge.
And that rapid decay sets the perfect stage for Section 2. Who were the Nephilim? Honestly, this is the greatest ancient debate. We're talking about one of the most bizarre and heavily argued passages in all of ancient literature. Let's look at exactly what went down.
So Genesis chapter 6 drops this bombshell. It states that the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took them as wives. This strange union leaves modern readers, and ancient scholars for that matter, scratching their heads, asking one massive question. Who exactly were these beings? What cosmic boundary was being crossed here that plunged the entire Earth into such unparalleled corruption? Impartially looking at the academic scholarship, there are basically 3 main theories floating around. Theory number 1 suggests they were the godly human line of Seth, who were improperly mixing with the ungodly line of Cain. Then there's theory 2, which argues they were fallen angelic creatures actively trying to thwart God's redemption by invading creation. And actually, this interpretation is supported by passages in Job in 2 Peter, where sons of God specifically refers to angels. Finally, the third theory views the whole thing as a sociological myth about ancient royal lines intermarrying with commoners, thereby crossing strict sociological boundaries. Look, we aren't here to pick a side today, but rather to show you just how deep this textual mystery really goes. The mystery only deepens when we look at the linguistics. Their offspring are called the Nephilim, which comes from the Hebrew verb naphal. Now, naphal literally means to fall. So this opens up a few wild possibilities. They could be morally fallen beings, they could literally be angels fallen from heaven, or maybe they were simply oppressively violent giants. We do know for sure they were large because later on in Numbers 13, the giant Anakim are said to be directly related to the Nephilim. But whatever they were, their presence coincided with an earth that had become absolutely filled with violence. Moving on to Section 3, the Great Flood. Exploring divine justice and preservation. Because human wickedness had just totally corrupted the earth, God steps in. And what's super interesting here is that the text uses the exact same Hebrew word for the earth's corruption as it does for God's impending destruction. It's this true measure-for-measure justice. God brings a massive, cleansing event that history knows as the Great Flood.
But to preserve life, God commands Noah, who the text describes as a righteous man, to build a tevah. Tevah is the Hebrew word for an ark, a craft, or life-preserving boat. God instructs Noah to preserve humanity and the animal kingdom by taking 2 of every unclean animal, but, and here's a detail people often miss, he's told to take 7 of every clean animal. Why the difference? Well, it's highly likely this specific instruction was designed to ensure there was a valid sacrificial process available immediately post-flood, since, remember, animals weren't actually given to humanity for food yet.
Now be honest, have you ever wondered if the flood was truly, literally global? When trying to interpret the famous 40 days of rain, a major geographical mystery pops up. Did this flood cover the entire globe, or did all the Earth just refer to the known habitable land in the Mediterranean basin? Scholars point out that the word all in ancient scripture often refers to a localized entirety rather than a whole planetary one. This makes sense, especially considering that current geological sediment records don't quite show one single concurrent universal flood across the entire planet.
And zooming out a bit, this biblical account builds a massive cultural contrast with other ancient Near Eastern flood myths. Take the Babylonian Gilgamesh epic, for example. Its hero, Utnapishtim, builds a giant cube-shaped boat. I mean, a cube? Not exactly seaworthy, right? Plus, he built it purely to selfishly hoard his gold and silver. Noah, on the flip side, builds a highly structurally sound craft designed for one purpose: to preserve God's creatures. It's a profound night and day difference in theology and how they viewed the character of the divine.
So, following the receding of the floodwaters, Noah exits the teva and immediately offers a sacrifice. In response to this, God establishes a brit, which is the Hebrew word for covenant. God makes this binding promise to never curse the ground in this exact, catastrophic, measure-for-measure way ever again. It's just an incredibly powerful moment of grace that sets a much-needed foundation of stability for humanity going forward.
Which brings us to Section 4, Noah's Downfall and Curse, diving into post-flood chaos. Humanity's fresh, newly cleansed start? Yeah, it's quickly derailed. Turns out, preservation through the flood unfortunately didn't mean the eradication of human flaw. This brings us right to the deeply chaotic incident of Noah's downfall and a devastating family curse in Chapter 9. Okay, so Noah plants a vineyard, gets drunk, and lies uncovered in his tent. Then his son Ham sees his father's nakedness. Now, scholars point out two main ways to actually understand this specific phrase. It either indicates a deeply shameful act of disrespect in an ancient honor-based culture, or, and this is based on the exact identical phrasing found later in Levitical laws, it implies a grievous, aberrant sexual act. Whatever the specific offense actually was, it was so incredibly severe that it resulted in Noah placing a lasting curse, but interestingly, not on Ham directly, but on Ham's son, Canaan.
And that leads us to our final section, Part 5, the Tower of Babel, exploring human hubris and dispersion. Moving into Chapter 11, as Noah's descendants multiply and inhabit the earth, human hubris rears its ugly head once more. The people gather on the plains of Shinar, completely united by a single language, and they decide to build a massive structure. Now, let's clear something up. The biblical Tower of Babel wasn't some modern skyscraper made of steel and glass. It was highly likely an ancient ziggurat, much like the reconstructed models we have from around 2100 BC. If you don't know what a ziggurat is, it's essentially a massive multi-tiered step pyramid featuring these huge sweeping ramps. Ancient Mesopotamian priests literally believed they could physically climb these ramps all the way out to the top tier and, well, meet the gods face to face.
So, the absolutely crucial point here is understanding the true motive behind this massive architectural project. This construction was driven by a really toxic mix of intense pride. I mean, they famously said, "Let us make a name for ourselves." And on top of that, a deep, paralyzing fear of being scattered across the earth. It's a powerful reminder of what happens when human ambition tries to displace the divine. And God's response? He ironically countered their efforts with measure-for-measure justice once again. He confused their single language, which totally broke down their communication, and then he scattered them across the globe anyway. It effectively ended their whole project of self-sufficiency.
As the dust finally settles on the abandoned construction site of Babel, and humanity is dispersed all across the ancient Near East, the camera of the narrative sharply focuses in on one specific lineage. We are left with a really provocative final thought. How will the sudden, quiet introduction of a single man named Abram, just tucked away in the genealogy of Shem, how will he completely alter the redemptive course of human history? Well, that is the next great mystery to unlock. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the ancient world.